Alrighty, so we are at week 10, a fun week in my opinion because we are going to revisit functions this week. We've been writing kind of what we term traditional functions, and the newer kid on the block, or the newer way the cool kids write, is with arrow functions. And so what you're going to do is learn how to write an arrow function. But before you do that, I'm actually going to teach you how to just name functions, because the thing we haven't done up to this point is actually give the functions a declared variable name, and that's a good thing to do. We always use const when creating those variable names, and it's just a better, more almost, I don't want to say strongly typed, but at least it's along the path of that. So we're going to do that in this week, and then you'll have a discussion. Now, in the discussion for this week, again, this is a second example of a week that's different, right? So we have the code challenge this week is updating functions. And as I was getting ready to do this video, I was remembering back about last semester and how students didn't have any problem with the default value, setting that up and showing examples of it. I don't tell you exactly where to implement it. I give you some flexibility in that case, right? But what you want to think about is why you would use default values, because oftentimes, if you're the only one writing your code base, chances are you're going to do a better job than if maybe you're on a big team, right, and making sure you're writing code that actually correctly passes those values. But even in the case that you're writing that code, it is still a good idea when needed, or when it could be a possibility that somebody else calls that function and doesn't pass that parameter. Remember, we're calling a function, we're passing it values, those are arguments, and we're passing them, they become parameters inside the function. So when default values allow you to set that inside as soon as you get to the signature of the function. But the one last time that threw students a little bit for how to implement it was the REST operator. So I would say to you first, and I covered a little bit here. This is a video from last semester where I talk about the REST operator a little bit. I end up in the solution doing it in a way that just kind of gets it done, because it wasn't a clear example in our code base for how to use it. Students came up with varying examples of solutions last time. And I think I end up backing out or taking the code that I ended up writing for the REST operator. And again, you'll learn more about this. So just know that when you reach that, if you're finding a challenge there, it's not unusual. Just figure out a way based on the documentation of the REST operator to get that done. Okay? Okay, so, but of course the big thing we're doing this week is our step 2. Okay, so what I want to do is really the bulk of this video is to go over the requirements here and just talk about the process, right? So first, if you've missed anything, because by this point when you get here you will have submitted your step 1, and in that case you want to fix any feedback I give you before starting here. And the thing I realize I think I'm going to do, and this is probably going to be true by the time you see this, is I think I am going to go through and do a couple of commits in here. I haven't done it in the past in the step 1, but I thought, it would be good. Like in this case, I'd want maybe a starting commit, right? And then, right, so, and actually these two are related, because here you're just setting up the folder for step 2, and then you're copying your code from step 1 into step 2. So probably actually right here would be a logical commit for starting step 2. Okay, so what are we doing this week? So this week, you're going to write at least 2 functions that handle your decision-making process, your code that you wrote from last week. And now last week I had you write a minimum of 2 if blocks. Okay, now it would be a normal thing to want to, and actually the way I approached it was this, is that for each of those if blocks I ended up writing functions, but I also wrote just a function that kind of coordinates all the activity. Right, so I ended up with, I think, 4, because I also had a function that was displaying to the page. Now I wouldn't, when we get to return values, that one that displays out to the page, I wouldn't consider that part of that core of what you're going to need. But it is always a good idea, and that's the other thing about functions, is that what you want is you want functions that are relatively concise in what they do. Simple inputs, simple outputs. When you can break things, and I actually ended up spending some time yesterday looking at the code that I wrote before and realizing that it's always true that when you don't look at something and you come back and look at it with a new pair of eyes on, and that's only because you're maybe more rested or for whatever reasons you've seen more examples, you're like, God, I could have done that so much better. But when you're writing functions, you really do want to have simple inputs, simple outputs. And I saw some places I could do that. So I ended up changing some names too, because I didn't like some of the names that I used. All right, so at least two named, in this case named. This is what we learned this week. You can use arrow functions or traditional functions. Either one's fine. I think using arrow functions is a good idea. We will talk about when we get to OOP when you don't want to use arrow functions, but for most of what we're doing here, you should be fine. Now, the concept here is to take the global variables that you created last week and pass them, right? So you're passing them into your function. So those global variables then are arguments you pass into your functions, right? So you should really, and this is the key here, is you should eliminate global variables. Now I'll show you my code. I think I ended up with one, and the only reason I ended up with one was because it was a reference to the document get element by ID. I could have eliminated that one, but in this case they're not global variables that were used in my code, so to speak. Right? If you're unable to do so, explain in the code comments why you were unable to eliminate global variables, but just know that's part of the goal of this. The step is for you to eliminate them, okay? Right, now let me just move over and show you for me. All right, here's an outline of my code. So here's my one global variable as far as setting up the output area. And you do want to output to the page. And I'm going to give you an option as far as how you save both the input data and the decision data. So in this case, I have a function for create the hit object, function for run object, the update, which is the DOM update, and then the activity decision itself. Now, and this is where the bulk of the code runs, or the code happens in here. And I did give an explanation for what's going to happen in here, right? So you can see here, right? So where I called, now, and you do want to, and you'll hear me talk about this in the requirements, you do want to you want to call your functions with enough of a variety of inputs to test all of your logic to make sure it's working as expected. Right? So in my case, I made sure I called it every day of the week because that's part of what my code checks for. I also called it with a variety of sleep scores so that I could make sure all of my logic indeed is working as intended. Now this is the beginning of a concept in programming that is very common called test-driven development. As a matter of fact, it's a very common practice for programmers to either write tests first and then write code, or write code and then write a test that will actually test to make sure the code they wrote creates the correct intended output. Okay? So in this case, this is what I was explaining here with I've eliminated the variables, the global variables except for the reference, which I'm okay with having one. But again, eliminate the ones that are needed for your decision to go where possible. And I've given you, again, an option if not. Okay, now the functions need to work together, right? This means that your functions need to have return values that are used in another function. So even though you're not seeing my code in general, when I pass Monday and a sleep score of 90 into this decision, this function, right? There's some logic in here that because it checks for the day, and then based on if it's a day that I do a HIIT workout, then it's passing those values of sleep score in BMR, my base, and which is a variable, by the way, that's inside of that block scope. And so when I then determine, based on my logic of sleep score, which workout I will do, then I return that value here, right? So that's what I mean by when you call a function, you do some work in that function, and then you return a value. And this is what you want. You want your functions shouldn't be standalone in the sense, they should all, in a sense, work together. Right, so then if it's a run day, then it runs this function, and then again it's returning some values that I then update to keep track, and this is kind of where I'm heading next, of both the inputs. So these are the inputs for my decision making app, and then the actual the decision itself is going to be how many calories I take in and which exercise I do that day. Okay, so coming back here, so when I talk, so I kind of ventured off a little bit, but this is the idea, is that you want your functions to work together. Okay, now create a data structure with both, this is what I just said, inputs and decision values. Now you can select the data structure you want. For this one, you could either just use a string, which, by the way, and I need to update this, if you're going to use a string, store it as a template string. Okay, use an array, you're welcome to do that, an object, or, and this is what we're going to do next week, an array of objects. Okay, so I'm going to run it this many times. Right, so in this case, I'm just going to pass in the actual text that I'm going to have my function here determine I want on the page. But in this case, I'm going to actually save that structure as an object. Okay, that was my choice for what I wanted to do this week, because I figured that gave me a perfect step to then go to an array of objects. Easy to update that. You get to choose. Okay. And this is what I was saying here. And this is about calling it several times. I've already talked about that. Make sure your code works and meets the requirements above. Okay, the other thing I wanted to show you is here is my code running in the browser, right? So, and let's just look at it before we look at here. So there's here's my output, right? And now I'm outputting a string, but the way I've organized that input values and the decision itself, right? So the amount of calories and the type of exercise was in an object. So I didn't actually have to iterate over an object. I just created a string based on the values that I wanted. So Monday sleep score to 90, should do a HIIT workout and take in that many calories. Okay, so you can see that here. So the thing I wanted to show you though was here in what the object itself looked like, right? So here is, let me pull this up a little bit. So I have 4 keys and 4 values, right? So cal intake, current day, exercise, and sleep score, right? So the sleep score and the current day are my input values, and my exercise and my calorie intake, right, is my decision. That's what came out. So when you're setting up that data structure, whatever it is, that's why I use an object. Again, I've given you some flexibility here, and it's kind of what I think students will choose is what they're more comfortable with, but I'm just showing you so you have an example of that. Okay? All right, so you'll do your commit history. I will include a couple of commits in here, probably at least 2, but feel free to also think about commits in terms of helping you kind of see your decision process, like, or your coding process that you went through in doing this, but I'll probably have a minimum of 2. Okay, so now coming back here to attendance, right? So, like always, start with working code this week. The one thing I want to make sure, do the thing it's all important, but do you understand? Because I actually gave an example several weeks ago where I actually gave a little more content about how to write functions and return values. So in the context of the decision making app step 2, do you have a good understanding of how to return, based on what I've talked about, or based on your own experience, how to use a return value, right? So I'm using a return value in another function call, right? So I'm creating that object, right? I then use that object in another function call. And this is a very common practice in programming, is that you're passing values through your functions, right? And then returning something that you will then use in some other function call. And that's understanding the benefit of that, eliminates global variables whenever possible, and it just makes your code more maintenance. And the other thing I could ask here is, like, do you understand the idea of simple inputs and outputs of functions and why you'd want to have that? You can answer either of those here. All right, have a good week. I'll talk to you soon.